Welcome to this Life Solved Short. I'm Robin Montague, and this is where we get a taste of world-changing research taking place at the University of Portsmouth, as featured in this season's Life Solved podcast. This time, how can virtual reality help us in preventing burglary? Between 2021 and 2022, there were 192,000 burglaries reported across England and Wales. The impact of this on a victim's personal property, as well as sense of security and safety in their own homes, can be huge. So how can we use some of the latest advancements in technology to tackle an age-old crime? Today, I'm joined by Matthew Talbot to find out more. Matthew, thank you for joining me.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Forensic psychology, then, for anyone who isn't aware of what that covers, because when I think of forensics, I think of, a crime has happened and actually going onto the scene and sort of looking at the forensics of the actual physical forensics of the scene. But forensic psychology, what does that involve?
It's a very broad spectrum within a very broad spectrum of psychology. You've got people that work directly with the police, people that might, the very kind of stereotypical view that you might have of someone who formulates a identity of a criminal based on the information that's available to them. You've got people that work directly in prisons with criminals, rehabilitation, or understanding why they might have committed a crime. You've got people like myself working with prevention and potential victims of burglary. You've got people who work directly with victims of crimes who may want to support them, help them after the fact, these kind of things. So it's a whole range, basically. There's loads of different stages of any kind of criminal process, and I think a forensic psychologist is just anyone, broadly speaking, that works within those stages.
It just reminds me of that series, I don't know if you've seen it, Mindhunter.
Yeah.
Brilliant show.
Yeah. And I think like any kind of media, especially where psychology is involved, there's always a little bit of dramatization of the field. We're not going out there and being able to completely guess who a killer is from one clue on a crime scene. But there are people out there, forensic psychologists out there, who do work, like I said, in that field of creating identities and knowledge about a criminal based on their behaviours. So
the psychology of burglars specifically, give us an insight into that then. What have you been looking at?
Well, in general, so the Virtual Burglary Project as a whole that I'm part of, seeks to understand how burglars operate, basically, the kind of reasons why they commit crimes, the behaviours they do when they're scouting a neighbourhood, when they're inside a house, what they do after a crime, and maybe insofar, especially in regards to what I'm doing, maybe challenging some people's perceptions. I think there's a perception of burglars, at least in the media, say, as these kind of like opportunistic, maybe slightly bumbling, maybe you've got like a swag bag and the black and white stripy top and things. And I think it's understanding that there's a bit more going on underneath than that, and maybe householders, for example, might need to do a bit more to help protect their own homes and these kind of things.
The way you described that burglar just reminded me of the burglar at McDonald's.
Yeah. The Hamburglar.
The Hamburglar, exactly. So it's not the Hamburglar that's probably breaking into your home, just throwing that out there now.
No.
So you mentioned there about some of the common misconceptions that people associate with burglars. So what are these? What have you found that people generally associate it with? And actually, what's the reality?
Well, I think people do have a good baseline knowledge of burglary. I think there are things that work that you and I, before I did the research, and novices, I think in general, would understand about how a burglar works, in terms of making sure you lock up your house and making sure you don't have objects in clear view. These kind of more obvious things. But I do find there's maybe a slightly deeper level that burglars operate on. They're very good at what they do, and they can process a lot of cues at once. They can process cues quite automatically and quite efficiently, and this leads to quite a deeper level of processing of the neighborhood, for example. We liken it to, say, learning to drive a car, for example. When you first learn to drive a car, it's all very deliberate and very, very thought-provoking. You think a lot about it. However, when you learn more about how to drive a car, you're not even really thinking about it. And that's kind of the level that burglars are at when it comes to burglary. They won't even necessarily be processing consciously some of the cues that they're picking up on, whereas householders don't necessarily have this level of expertise. So it's things like end of terrace houses, for example, or corner houses. They're often a lot more vulnerable because burglars see the extra exits, extra entrances, one less house on the side, so less potential to be seen by a neighbour. And I found from my research, householders didn't necessarily think about these things. And we mentioned security before, still a very good and very effective way of preventing burglaries. But I find that householders tend to really place a lot of stock in security. Burglars typically don't, because they know there's always some kind of exploit, maybe an open window or an unlocked back door. A lot of householders put a lot of their security front facing. I guess it shows a nice protected house, but then their back door is a bit less protected, and that's often how burglars end up getting in. So it's these just kind of like slightly more matching the perceptions and the behaviours to what burglars do and what they're looking for.
And I suppose the sort of the burglary prevention methods, they haven't really changed that much. They've obviously, the technology's advanced, but like you said, it's don't leave your windows open on a warm day, and have like a security alarm system on display. Don't put any pricey objects in front of your windows and stuff like that. But they haven't really changed that much over the years.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of then the research that I'm doing, because burglary has gone down over the last 20 years or so, 30 years or so. It is on a slight decrease, but as you mentioned at the start, it's still a highly prevalent crime and still a crime that has a lot of impact for a victim, both financial and psychological. So it's clear that these kind of more basic methods, the police websites and the newsletters and the neighbourhood watch schemes, whilst they might not necessarily be, we're not saying all these methods are wrong and they don't protect your house from burglary, but there's just a bit of a need to maybe refresh, maybe find better ways of imparting this knowledge, because clearly there's still a gap that needs to be fixed.
And why do you think burglary levels are dropping? Is it just because they're better at policing, or?
Well, there's a very popular hypothesis by a researcher, Graham Farrell, who has basically looked at this idea of a security hypothesis, where basically as security is getting better, there's less chances for burglary, basically, and because it becomes more affordable, it means that you're not just limiting the best security measures and the best prevention methods to the highest earners. You can, anyone these days hopefully could be able to afford locks on their door and motion activated lights and these kind of things, because as security gets better, it also becomes cheaper, more widely available, and therefore we are seeing less burglary. Unfortunately, we are sometimes seeing burglary get pushed down now towards the lowest earners. We're talking people that earn maybe like less than £7,000 a year and these kind of things, which is unfortunate, because obviously these are the people that are already suffering quite a lot, and then the burglaries are getting almost pushed on them. But it does seem like as a whole burglaries are dropping, which is quite nice.
Obviously, we've said about how it's a really big issue still, even though it has started to decline. Clearly, it's going in the right direction. But why is it a challenge for law enforcement?
During a crime, I think the one key thing is what I've already mentioned about how efficient burglars are and how effective they are at what they do. I think off the top of my head, the average time is less than 8 minutes, I think, to complete a burglary. They really are kind of, and you watch it when say Claire, for example, Professor Claire Nee does her work with the burglars, and they're in the mock burglary settings. They go through very quickly. They're very good and effective at what they do. They typically spend less time in the neighbourhoods than regular people, but they cover more distance, so they really are being efficient. And I think because of that, it can be quite hard to stop a burglary in progress, which, to give it a slightly more positive spin, is why our work in terms of teaching people to prevent burglaries is quite important, because what you tend to see a lot with experts, as you might see in general, and we're talking not just experts in terms of like, say, traditional sense of someone that's really highly qualified, but what you'd call a functional expert, someone who has got enough skill that they can, just like we talked about driving a car, who can do things without really thinking about it. But what you find in those cases is if you introduce a new element, an unfamiliar element, it can really throw someone. You think about taxi drivers, there's some research done on this, where if you introduce a new route to a taxi driver, it can really throw their mental processes and the days pre-sat nav when they all had to remember all the routes and everything. So I think the key good thing about our work is that we really are trying to introduce maybe householders putting some expensive items that they don't maybe touch that often into the bathroom where the burglars don't go, so that when they're looking for these really expensive jewellery items, these passports, they get into the bedroom and they just can't find them, and they're spending more time in the bedroom and more chance of them being caught.
Throw them off their game.
Exactly, throw them off their game.
Speaking about the virtual reality, where does that come into it? So you've interviewed the burglars, you've gotten some insight into how they would operate. So how do you take that insight and combine it with technology?
Well, you get the in terms of the burglary focused research, you get the burglars to do the burglaries. We have virtual neighborhoods of houses, loads of different ones. Some of them are just one house, so you can maybe afford to put a bit more detail into that house because you've got things like processing power and technological limitations that come into play. But sometimes it's just one house and you can have a really nice detailed house. There was a study that Claire did where they had an unfamiliar room, like a recording studio actually, inside a virtual house, and it found that, like we were talking about in terms of burglars preferring patterns, they really avoided that room. They really weren't comfortable going in that room because it was different to what they'd normally experience inside a house, whereas householders, they were just going in there and they were looking for things to steal. So you've got that. You've got the ones that I worked with, for example, which are 5 houses, and burglars and householders can explore around the neighbourhood, pull out some things that they might do or not do, houses that they might like to burgle, houses they might avoid, and then they can actually go inside them and burgle them at the same time. And then the other side of that is some of these virtual neighborhoods are expansive, huge, great big virtual neighborhoods, but you can't typically go inside them because, again, that would create processing, and that would take a lot of processing power. So there's been some work done by some of our colleagues, for example, looking at avatars and the effect that people can have on deterring burglary just by being present in their neighborhoods. So it's a whole great big neighborhood of just the outside of houses, and they put in little virtual avatars that maybe intervene, maybe just watch, and maybe just don't do any of that. Maybe they're just present in the neighborhood, and finding that even just by being present in the neighborhood, burglars are likely to rate the houses as less.
And how do you see this technology being received then? If it's obviously the findings continue to be really promising, and you can see a really, a genuinely impactful way of preventing burglary, is this something that the police would offer people, do you think? It would be something they just download themselves at home?
Yeah. A lot of that is outside of because it depends on the progression of the technology. Which is a little bit obviously outside our control. But yeah, I think there are stages. Assuming we're in this world where this has been established and all these things I've said before have come to pass, so we know that it's something that really does work, say long term, and it works with people actually changing their behaviour inside their own house, then you could work, for example, at a student level, organising something where students could come along and put on the headset and be trained, even if it's just one day. You think of like Freshers' Fair, for example, something similar to that, where new students can get trained basically, or students that are just about to leave halls and move into their own housing could potentially be trained. So you've got that. You've got, exactly like you say, potentially downloadable software and whatnot, or something that could be offered via governmental establishments or the police and things like this. And it really just depends on how much, whether people can do it on their own volition or whether we have to have a centralized thing that people can come to, depends on how affordable and widespread the technology becomes, basically.
Fantastic. Well, this is really interesting. Thank you so much for meeting with me today, Matthew. And good luck with your next research projects.
Thank you.
If you'd like to hear the full interview, listen to the Life Solved podcast on the University of Portsmouth website or your favourite podcast app now. Just search for Life Solved. You can also click the link in the comments box below or head to port.ac.uk/research. See you again next time.